Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And we are back here with Joe Grabas. Excited to have him here because he's our genealogical expert and so much more. He founded his own continuing education program, his institute back in 2018, Grabas Institute for Continuing Education, and he's really helping people bring so much back to the community in regards to the history, in regards to genealogy. We're going to talk today. He also helps search for familial connections. And so I know you're a professional genealogist, right? And you really use that skill quite often in your work. And besides all that you do with the mortgages and the deeds and helping people, especially in the state of New Jersey and elsewhere, you really have wear a lot of hats, I should say. So let's, for a quick introduction, let's start a little bit about you and then talk specifically about how you started in genealogy. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. It's good to be with you again. I am a forensic land title expert, which means I'm called upon quite often to help folks work out issues with their property, whether they be boundary line disputes or missing heirs or restrictive covenants, things of that nature, things that will prevent them from either using, transferring, or financing their property. And so I'm often called upon to do the research and then testify in court.
Yeah.
And yes, genealogy plays a big role in what I do.
Oh, well, tell me. I mean, this is pretty fascinating, the work you're doing. And can I call you a genealogist? Is that the correct terminology?
Yes, I'm a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists, and I do genealogy. I'm not the guy you call if you just wanted to work your family tree back. That's not really what I focus on. Not that I can't do it, but it's not my focus in my business. I'm sort of a reverse genealogist, if you could think of it that way. Most people search for their ancestors. They're going back in time. And I did it myself for my own personal information, find out who my grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, et cetera, going back. But I, in turn, really are looking for people's descendants or their heirs. Usually I'm called upon to find the living descendants of a person from the 19th century. I'm working on a case now where there was a church and the church land was granted back in the late 19th century, like 1890. And part of that deed was that it could never be used for anything but a church. And they built a church there. And then around the mid-50s, the church burnt down. Instead of building the church there again, they built it somewhere else on a bigger piece of property that was better for their congregation. Well, now they want to sell that old piece of property. And unfortunately, not only is it restricted to just being used as a church, but it's also says if you stop using it as a church, we get the property back. That guy from 1890, he gets the property back. Of course, he's dead, right?
Yeah.
What's he going to do with it? So I have to find out the person who actually owns his interest today. And usually that passes down in one of two ways, either through his will and the wills of others, or more likely through what they call intestate succession. If you die without a will, politicians get to decide who gets your property. The people down in the state house, they decide who's going to get your property. And that changes from year to year. Back in 1890, if you died, your spouse was not entitled to get anything that you owned unless you specifically left it. Today, your spouse is the first person to get something that you own. As a matter of fact, you can't eliminate your spouse. Even if you leave a will, you can't leave them out of the will. They'll still get a portion of it. So things have changed considerably over time. And so what I do is I try to find those people and connect those links in the chain forward and try to find out who their descendants are today. And of course, they can be
Wow.
spread all over the country
Huh.
or the world for that matter.
Amazing. And my goodness. So just curious, if for those people out there who into this, is there schools where you actually physically go to learn? How do you learn about this? And we'll talk some about these research tools that you get to use most often.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, there's a lot of stuff online. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of stuff online. There are a couple of recognized schools, Boston University, Brigham Young University. The Mormons have been collecting familial information forever. They have the largest library in the country, and it's called FamilySearch.org.
Okay.
You can search there. A lot of people are familiar with Ancestry, but it really started with Family Search. They were the first,
Really?
the Mormons were the first ones to do it. Um, but there's also a whole plethora of online genealogical courses that you can take. Just go to Google and type in genealogical courses or schools, and everything will pop up. So there is no shortage of places to go to get this information.
All right. Well, that's good to know. My goodness. What else is on tap for today? Because there's a lot of different research that goes into it and different techniques. Is there something in particular that you're using more often than not? What is the research tools for today? Back in the day, it was probably going out to town hall, the microfiche, and the library. I mean, which you still may have to do, but what are some of the techniques you're doing now?
Well, yeah. So a lot of people don't realize that Google has only been around for 25 years. That's it, 25 years. How do we ever live without Google, right?
Yeah.
But it's 25 years. So before that, we had to do exactly what you were saying. You had to get in the car, travel to repositories, the archives, the county clerk's offices, the township clerk's offices to get death certificates and birth certificates and things like that, or right away in correspondence to all these places and hope that they show up. So now, what you can do online in a matter of hours would take you weeks or even months to do in the past. And so the places that I go most often are Ancestry, Ancestry.com. I also use a place called whitepages.com, and that helps you find people today. It's maybe a little scary, but I could type your name in right now and find out all of your phone numbers you've used,
Yeah.
every place you've ever lived, and people who are related to you. It all
Yeah.
pops up and shows. Um, but that helps me out greatly. But it is a little invasive, right?
Mm,
The other thing is newspapers.com. And the thing about that is that they keep adding more and more newspapers all the time. So the information keeps coming. Genealogical research you have to return to over and over and over again. I've been doing my family for some 30 years now, and I just recently found the town that my Italian great grandparents came from, Cassano Ionio, uh, for the first time just 2 years ago, because those records were finally put up online, and I wouldn't have been able to get them before, or it would have been very difficult. So you have to keep going back, and things continue to pop up. And of course, my particular expertise, the land records. The land
okay. That's
records
right.
provide you with information that you wouldn't have. I'm working on a case, right now where it was an old school that was conveyed, but they never recorded the deed. It's mentioned in other deeds, but there's no actual deed. And so I had to go back and find the original guy and then bring him forward. And by looking at the deeds in his family, I was able to find out who he was related to, especially when you're dealing with um, daughters. Of
Hmm.
course, their maiden name is one name, but then who did they marry?
Yeah.
Well, the wonderful thing about New Jersey is that we have this thing called dower and courtesy, actually up until 1980. After that, it's been abolished, which meant that every time you sold a piece of property, your spouse had an interest in it. So they had to sign the deed. So if I would have sold my property in 1950, my
Hmm.
wife would have had it been on the deed, and I would have seen that, and vice versa. Okay. So that's a really good tool to use to find out whose spouses are when you're doing your genealogical work.
Got it. And also, just to remind everyone, Joe, how we can contact you, would you mind sharing that information?
Sure, you can find me at www.forensictitleexpert.com or www.continuingeducationnj.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can reach out to him and let's continue the conversation today about the work he does in genealogy and all the, I mean, just looking at the books behind you, it's like, ha! Yeah, you know those genealogy books. By the way, some of us were on the Zoom cast. If you're just on the podcast, we're actually speaking today live face to face, so I get to see what's behind him. And boy, oh boy, I've never seen so many books.
Well, I'm a bit of a bibliophile. I love a good book. It's my constant companion. But most of them I get for resource purposes. For reference, to reach out and just grab a book. And many of them are genealogical references, Scottish references for my wife's family, and Polish references for my family. That was one of the interesting things about doing my own genealogy, is that I'm made up of 7 different nationalities.
Mm-hmm.
And my people came over to Ellis Island, so there's a rich history there and a lot of places to go. Some of the stuff I was able to do myself. Some of the stuff I had to hire a Polish genealogist to go and look, because I couldn't read Polish or Russian. That's one of the things you run into. It's okay if you're Irish or if you're English, you're going to find English records. But if you're Polish or Italian like me and don't speak either of those languages, it gets more difficult, and you'll have to hire somebody to assist you or learn how to speak Polish, right?
Yeah.
However, one of the things you find out is, as you go back in time, the language that they spoke then is not the same as it is now. In New Jersey, our land was owned by the Dutch, and the Dutch that's used in those deeds, there's only this one guy. His name is Mr. Gehring up in Albany, and he can translate the old Dutch records because it's a different kind of Dutch. So these are some of the obstacles that you run into, and you do need to get professionals to help you out and assist you in things like that. One of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that you have to be careful when you're doing your research.
Yep.
You have to understand that you're not always going to find what you're expecting to find.
Mm-hmm.
I found out my great-grandfather was married twice. I didn't know that. How did I find that out? Sure enough, in a deed, there was his name and a wife's name, Magdalena. I had never heard of Magdalena. Nobody had ever heard of Magdalena.
Oh my goodness.
He had another wife. I found out my uncle had collected welfare at one time, and that my great-grandfather was in the house building business with his brothers, but then they separated. And everybody always said, well, it was because they were communists. That was what the line in our family. They were communists. My research shows that it was actually a business dispute.
Okay.
And that's what made them separate. And I guess they just used the communist thing because it was easier. Yep, exactly.
Wow.
So don't always believe everything. I always thought I was Irish. Then I went and I did that 23andMe. I don't have a speck of Irish in me. However, I am part Greek, and I didn't know about
you didn't
that.
know.
So you learn things as you go through. Be open and accepting. Have patience. Okay? Don't look for what you want to find. Find for what you're looking for. That's what you need to think about. You might be disappointed or shocked or even heartbroken. But remember, they're people, they're human beings, and we all have our failings. And I think it just gives you an opportunity to understand what you came from and how you arrived at where you are today, what people had to go through. I think one of the things I teach my students quite often is that the difference between today and 100 years ago is, back then it was work or die. It was very much about survival. There was no Social Security, there was no welfare, there was none of these things. And so that made our ancestors look at life very differently than the way we look at it today,
Mm-hmm.
and the things that they had to go through. And that's kind of some of the stuff that comes out of that. One particular story I found, I was doing some research, and this gentleman and his wife left his property to four men. Two of them had the same last name, two of them had different names. And in the deeds, it said that each one of them would be responsible for 1/5 of his and his wife's upkeep. This is about 1860.
Oh, wow.
And I found out that the two guys who didn't have the same last name were his sons-in-law.
Oh my
So he
gosh.
basically liquidated all of his property, put it into his son and sons-in-law's names, and said,
Wow.
"You have to take care of us for the rest of your life." Because
Oh
he
my
didn't,
goodness.
yeah, because he didn't have a pension, he didn't have
Wow.
welfare, he didn't have Social Security.
Yeah.
The way he was able to secure his golden years was through his property. And these are the kind of things that you're going to find out as you go and do this research, and look into the land records and look into your family.
Wow, impressive. Well, I was going to ask you some examples, but clearly looking at land records, those are them. Great examples. And what else can you find out from land records? And is it really hard to use them?
So no, it's not. I mean, especially nowadays, because it's mostly all online. In
Mm-hmm.
New Jersey, 20 of the 21 counties are online. I do a lot of research all across the country. I was just doing some work. I found stuff in Santa Clara, California. I found stuff down in Monroe, Florida, and the stuff is online, and it's relatively easy to get to. It's like doing a Google search. The thing to remember when
Mm-hmm.
you're doing these searches is always use the less is more technique.
Okay.
Whenever you're doing research on a digital database, less is more. What do I mean by that? Don't type in Joseph A. Grabas, type in J. Grabas. You're going to get more results that way. It'll take you a little bit longer to work through the results because you're going to be looking at Josephine and James and things like that. But if they spelt my name Josef like it used to be spelt in
Then.
Poland, I wouldn't find that if I typed in Joseph. So
Mm-hmm.
less is more when you're dealing with online databases. Now, it gets a little more complicated when you have to go to the courthouse itself. And one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that happens with land records is most of the people nowadays in these clerk's offices and registrar's offices take the records from today and go backwards. So many of them you can only get back to like 1990 or 1980 or 1970. The records I deal with are mostly in the 19th century. You're not going to find a lot of those records online. In Warren County, they go all the way back to 1822, but that's not the norm. That's not the norm at all online. So the best thing to do is go online, see how far the records go back, and decide whether you've got to make a road trip to one of these places to get back into your family tree.
Wow. Wow. All right. All right. Joe, what else should we discuss today in regards to the benefits of genealogy and how it can help us?
Well, I think that the great thing about genealogy is, of course, that not only do you have a personal connection to it if you're doing your own genealogy in your own family, um, but as I do genealogies for other families, um, you get to find out really interesting stuff about people, ordinary people. I mean, we read about George Washington or Frederick Douglass or people of that nature, but how often do we learn about the ordinary people? And so, one of
Mm-hmm.
the most recent things I did, that one with the school, it came through a family called the Holcombs, Holcomb. And in doing the work, I found out that one of this guy's son, John Cole Holcomb's son, Richard, died,
Hmm.
uh, and very young. And I'm like, what's that all about? And as I did more research on him, I found out that he was one of three guys who wanted to start the first steamboat service up the Delaware River from Easton, Pennsylvania, up
Wow.
to Milford. And the day that he started it, he got on the boat, him and his other two compatriots, and they got on the boat.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy who was the engineer for the boat, who engineered the boat, said, I'm not getting on that boat. So what are you talking about? I'm not getting on the boat. The guy who installed the boiler didn't know what he's doing. That's not a safe boat. They poo-pooed him, got on the boat anyway. The boat was about 100 feet from shore and it exploded and blew up and killed everybody.
Come on.
Yep, yep. And so nobody ever decided to do that again. There was never any steam service up the Delaware from that point. There was from Easton south
Wow.
to
Yeah.
Trenton and down out in, to Philadelphia, but nobody ever went north from there. And so that changed these people's lives because this man was struck down in the prime of his life, was maybe 30 years old, left a bunch of children. And, you say to yourself, what happened? Did he have life insurance, right? There was no
Mm-hmm.
Social Security benefits for these young kids. How did they get by? What happened? And one of the things I find in the land records, the earlier land records, especially in the 1700s, is what they call putting out of children. When children became orphans, there was no orphanage, and sometimes there was no family, so they would pay people to take these children in, like foster homes. But
Oh,
really, it was not quite like a foster home. These children had to go and work. They were put into apprenticeships, and they would work for that family for the next 20 years, 21 years. At the end of that time, they would be given a suit of clothes and some tools of their trade, whatever they learned, whether they were a blacksmith or whatever, and then pushed out into the world and said, good luck.
wow.
So, we wonder how people survived back then. Remember, I told you
Mm-hmm.
about work or die. This was a situation where this person's parents died and now they had to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in my book, by the way, which is right over my head here, Owning New Jersey. I have a whole chapter about the putting out of children. And these are things that I found in the land records. So if you were the descendant of one of these children who was put out, you would find that information in the land records about the fact that your great grandfather was put out to a tailor and he became
Wow.
a tailor, and that's why you're all tailors today. You know,
Interesting. Wow. This is I mean, do you have time for another story? We got 3 minutes left. Yes.
sure.
Tell us something else. These are great stories.
So yeah, I mean, probably one of my favorite stories from my book is about a guy named Catalina Lambert, and on the front of the cover of the book is a picture of his castle, and it still stands above Patterson, above the city of Patterson. It sits up on a hill, and at one time he had the largest private art collection in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and he built this castle to hold this art collection. He was a silk master. The Patterson used to be called the Silk City, and big silk manufacturers. Well, he came here from England with like $5 in his pocket, and he became one of the richest men in the country. And then the silk people went on strike, and he had to mortgage not only his house but all the artwork in it. And in a mortgage in Passaic County is a list of every piece of artwork he had. And these pieces of artwork were by Monet, by Renoir, at a
Mm-hmm.
time when these guys were just making a name for themselves. They weren't like we all know who Monet is today.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, he was a
But
new artist. And he wound up having to sit there and watch every single piece of art sold in order to save his home. Every Monet, every Renoir, things that today are selling for tens of millions of dollars were sold for a couple of $100 at the time. And he had to sit there and watch that happen. so that he could preserve his home, and it still stands today. And it's a great place to go visit, by the way.
Amazing. Well, thank you for these stories today and really diving into genealogy and the importance of it and the work you're doing. If someone does want to reach out to you, Joe, how can we do so?
You can visit me at forensictitleexpert.com or continuingeducationnj.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Pleasure having you here and looking forward to the next time we connect. Have a great day. And to all of
Thank
our
you.
listeners, thank you. Stay tuned
So
for
long.
the show is on the way.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.